Hello and welcome to MENA Grand Prix Talk. My name is Mark Hamilton, joining you live from Vancouver, British Columbia. We have an incredibly special guest today, but I will introduce him in a minute. Before I do so, I'd like to introduce our panel for MENA Grand Prix. We are joined by three F1 intellectual subject matter experts. Joining me today live from Qatar, from Doha, Mr. Sharbel Saloom. Sharbel, F1 techie, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm good. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm doing amazing. Ahmed Bakhba, you are joining us today from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I think you're about 3 hours ahead of me time zone wise. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing amazing. And then finally, the one, the only Mamdouh Khayat, my friend, welcome to this episode. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. You are most welcome. I am in Jeddah. Jeddah today is very hot and humid. Unbelievable weather.
I understand based on some conversations recently, it's been hitting close to 50 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity. Unimaginable. So our special guest today, the one, the only, some of you may know him as Natural Paradigm based on his Twitter handle. Some of you might know him as Bryson Sullivan. Bryson, my friend, we're incredibly lucky to have you here today. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you for having me. I know I planned to come on the show a bit earlier, but glad we're finally able to get to do it.
Yeah, it's incredibly fortunate for us to have you here. You've developed, and I want to make sure that our audience understands a little bit better, but 2-3 years ago, your presence on the internet was largely through your Twitter account. And you've grown enormously since then. You have a huge following based on the fact that you produce amazing, genuinely authentic content. You have your own podcast now. Take us a little bit on your social media, your internet journey, where it began and how you got to the destination you're currently enjoying.
I would argue it's largely an accident, if I'm being honest with you. Honestly, I'm just one of those people who just has an engineering background and loves Formula One and loves talking about the technical side of Formula One. And I just do that publicly too much, essentially. But if there is something, a concept or a design or anything worthwhile talking about in the Formula One space, and I can give some insight into it, I always try to do that. And often I have an eye for detail that I actually can't turn off. Right. So I will sometimes see things that other people won't see, not because I'm a more talented engineer than them. There are plenty of more talented people in the space than me, but oftentimes people like hearing it from me, which is a different skill, I suppose. But no, I'm very glad that the F1 tech community has been growing so much in general. I do have a podcast, the Tech Heads F1 podcast. It really was just a way to document conversations that we were already having. It was never really seen to be something that was going to blow up per se, but we do have some great conversations there, and I'm enjoying the 2023 season unfold.
Bryson, I've heard this story before and I get such a kick out of it, but maybe share with our listeners today how your fandom of F1 began and what the first event was that you saw live and in person.
Yeah, as I said, some of the best things in life happen accidentally. I probably was as ignorant of Formula One as anyone else, early on, until one random weekend when I had some especially insistent friends physically drag me to a race kind of against my will. I said, I don't want to go see cars racing. Why would I go see that? They're just driving in circles, aren't they? When I actually went to the race and saw the performance of these Formula One cars, the top speed, the braking, and specifically the lateral acceleration that they are capable of, it just blew me away. And the reason why you mentioned that event was so noteworthy was because it was the 2005 USGP at Indianapolis, where there are only 6 cars there totally. And so if you ever wanted to gauge my bona fides as far as how in love I am with the technology and performance part of these cars, the actual thing that got me into Formula One was historically one of the worst races in the history of the sport. Because it's always been about the cars for me, more so than the racing. The racing is a bonus, and I always appreciate it. But just seeing the cars themselves has always been what's drawn me to it.
It's a remarkable story because people have argued that the 2005 US Grand Prix killed interest in Formula One in the United States for the better part of a decade. And meanwhile, it was the thing that pulled you into this ecosystem and this sports fandom. So, gentlemen, like we said earlier when we were getting ready for the show, we've really got 4 topics today. And the topics that we want to discuss is, one, briefly recap the 2023 championship and really get into how it is that Red Bull has established such a dominating lead on the rest of the field. Secondly, I think it's worth getting into Aston Martin, that Aston Martin has been the surprise of the championship, and they've developed some significantly advanced performance capabilities versus last year. Then we'll discuss a little bit about Alpine. Of course, this is on the heels of some comments from Laurent Rossi a few weeks ago at Miami that seems to have spurred some advancement in their on-track performance. And then finally, we'll wrap this up by talking about the 3 2023 rookies and Oscar Piastri, Nick De Vries, and Logan Sargent. So I'm going to kick it over to Bryson to start. You know, last year, the first year of the new regulations, Red Bull dominated. Max Verstappen won the championship, 144 points up on Charles Leclerc. Red Bull won the championship, 205 points up on Ferrari. This year, it seems like that dominating lead has actually increased as we sit here. Max is leading the Drivers' Championship by 53, but that's up on his teammate. And Red Bull is currently leading the Constructors Championship by 135 points on Mercedes. We're currently 7 races into a 22 race calendar. So you could say we're a third of the way in. So this is kind of the 1/3 mark. But Bryson, maybe for people that aren't as intimately involved as the championship, as this panel is, maybe kind of take us back a year or 2 years and help explain how Red Bull has built such a dominating lead on the rest of the field.
What's so interesting about this situation is that given the way the 2021 championship ended, and given the obviously the tumultuous nature of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, but more importantly, what actually happened with the development race between those two teams, Mercedes and Red Bull. Mercedes had said publicly that they were going to stop developing their 2021 car specifically to focus on 2022 because there's such an important change in the regulations. And Red Bull says, no, we're going to keep building and bringing parts to our car as well. And the championship went down to the wire, obviously. And so imagine everyone's surprise when the 2022 season began. And not only was Mercedes not the class of the field, but they were in the worst position that they've been in 10 years or something like that, some sort of extreme measure. And as you talk about Red Bull and their dominance, quote unquote, last season really going into dominant form this season, there's really a combination of 2 things. One of them is the ground effect style of car is one of the things that's right in the wheelhouse of an Adrian Newey type of character. And again, there's more than one person in the team than Adrian Newey, but he is exactly who you'd want to have in your team for that type of change in regulations. But also, it has to do with the weaknesses, I would say, of some of the other teams, and also Red Bull's own weakness in producing a car that was initially, under the weight limit or on the weight limit. The car that we saw Red Bull start the season with in 2022 was a very good car. We didn't realize it at the time, but it was significantly overweight. It had a few aerodynamic issues, and it actually wasn't as good as that concept actually could have been. And so it actually made Ferrari and some of the other teams look closer to them than they actually were. In the offseason, between 2022 and 2023, Red Bull addressed all of those deficiencies, got their car to the weight limit, had some very advanced changes in their aerodynamics as well, and showed what the potential of the concept actually was. And now we find ourselves in 2023 where basically every team, Mercedes and even Ferrari now. Ferrari was a team that was fighting with Red Bull for the championship last season. Even they are starting to radically shift their concept because they're realizing that there's just not enough pace in what they currently have.
Ahmed, I'm going to kick it over to you because I know you have a very soft spot for Mercedes, and you and I have had many passionate conversations about them over the course of the last 18 months. Were you surprised that coming into the 2023 championship that they didn't bring a fundamentally radically redesigned aero concept, that they seemed, at least on the surface, to carry over a lot of the formula that maybe made them unsuccessful in 22?
Well, look, I'm sure anybody that doesn't work with a Formula One team, they will they will be just talking nonsense if I'm gonna tell you I was surprised or not surprised or anything. I don't have Adrian Newey vision to know what Mercedes saw in the wind tunnel or in the CFD. Maybe they saw something that it could work for the team and work for the car, but then when it came down to put down the gauntlet on the track, things didn't just work out simply. But now, when you look at the new redesigned car, I'm not saying that the car is fast and they could catch Red Bull, but it's in a good spot, predictable. They can work with it.
Yeah.
They could see what they can bring from upgrades to the car in general. Uh, so that's pretty much the Mercedes that we now know. But Mercedes working with an unpredictable car, that's something it feels like an alien thing to hear from a team that dominated for 8 years, especially in Constructors Championship. Um, in general, looking at the season and how things are going with them, I just believe the one string that Mercedes have, they have the strongest driver lineup on the grid. Like without a doubt, you have Lewis Hamilton. Probably, I'm gonna say he's on par on race pace with Max Verstappen if the machinery is there to help him fight for a win at least. And George Russell is no alien for a fast race pace. He's about a tenth or not even that far behind Lewis in race pace, and sometimes he's even a bit faster in some tracks if he feels comfortable in the car. But overall, I think if anything, I don't see anybody closing the gap in general to Red Bull anytime soon, unless by some miracle Adrian Newey decides to go build boats for Red Bull in American Cup next season or the season after. Then that's probably the only time we're gonna see somebody trying to close the gap. And Mercedes keeps James Allison and everyone on deck and hands on deck working on their car for the 2025. That's the only time we're gonna see anybody closing the gap. And I'm saying not competing, closing the gap to Red Bull.
Charbel, I think Bryson did a fantastic job of summarizing how we got to our current state with respect to Red Bull and the things that they did during their development journey. A couple of weeks ago, Toto Wolff was quoted as saying, "Hey, maybe the worst thing that happened to us in terms of our development cycle was winning that race in Brazil towards the end of last year." Of course, George Russell won the sprint, he won the Grand Prix, and I think if you unpack what he was suggesting is it reinforced in their minds that maybe the development concept, the development cycle that they were working on was actually correct. And I think based on some recent changes, the front suspension, the side pods, and the floor, maybe it wasn't correct. From your perspective, how far is Mercedes? And again, like Ahmed just said a few minutes ago, we don't have access to the CFT data. We're not sitting there in the wind tunnel as they're running out those half-scale cars. But from your perspective, how far is Mercedes from Red Bull at this year? And is there any chance you could see them winning a race this year, short of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez making a mistake on track?
Well, Mark, let me tell you something that the upgrades that Mercedes came up the past 3 weeks, I feel it like it's just unfair for the philosophy that they had last year. Okay, it's not the problem with a lot of people are saying, okay, thank God they brought the side pods back because it's not the side pods, guys. It's the whole concept, the whole philosophy of the car, the under the floor, the suspension. With this car, Mercedes, you can say that they have started on this much stable platform, a better platform to jump forward, okay, to upgrade the car. Especially if you have, like Ahmed said, it wasn't stable or something, but this car, you can go forward from here. You can correlate or you can check the data correctly that you are having from CFD, from the wind tunnel, and compare it to whatever is happening on track. So I see Mercedes are gonna close the gap faster this year. I'm totally different. I'm talking something completely different than Ahmed, but hey, it is a healthy thing to disagree. I think they're gonna be able to close the gap. Probably, as you said, they might win. Okay, the car could win some races, but of course, on the other hand, you have Max Verstappen, you have the Red Bull, Sergio Perez. So you should have something catastrophic from the other side, and something like 100% total, no mistake, with the Mercedes in that weekend, so they would be able to win a race this year.
Bryson, I know you're eager to reflect on those comments of Ahmed and Charbel. Did you have anything to add or a different perspective to share?
I have to say
Mamdou,
something.
I'll kick it over to you. I think you've got something to add.
Yes, please. Something very important. Today, if we make analysis between Barcelona last year and this year, or Spanish Grand Prix 22 and 23, the difference between Red Bull and Mercedes, it was 8th of a second. Today is 4th of a second. It means they have smashed four
Tenths,
points
yeah.
From Red Bull. And I believe with the second part of the development on the wind tunnel, they will change a lot of things. They will close the gap, or it might be a little bit advanced than Red Bull. This is what I can see from my analysis, from my reading. They will go a little bit faster, especially on the last 5 races of the year.
You're gonna put a smile on Mercedes fans right now.
Not me.
Mamdou, while you're on the mic, I kind of want to spin this in a slightly different direction. Last year, Ferrari finished second in the Constructors Championship quite comfortably. Charles Leclerc finished P2 in the Drivers' Championship. Currently, they sit a distant P4. And of course, there was the well-documented change of team principal in the offseason. Matteo Binotto politely exited, possibly before he was pushed out the door. They brought over Frederic Vasseur, and I think on the track they've overwhelmingly disappointed. Can you share your thoughts on this team? And of course, from Frederic Vasseur's perspective, he inherited this car. He inherited the driver's lineup. He's basically just carrying over the game plan, the playbook that would have been established last year. What do you think is the trajectory for this team? And do you see them possibly improving as the year goes on?
Look, when the Grand Prix was in Jeddah here, I met with Frederic Vasseur, and I had a chat with him on what is the future situation with the Ferrari. He said we are on the line, we are on the right way, in the right direction on the development on the car. And the problem, I tell you, he didn't say it, but this is from my analysis. The problem is not the car, not the team, it is the two drivers, Charles and Carlos. This is the big. Yes.
Shots fired.
I don't want to say fired, but I don't want to say fired. But the problem they have it here. They need some psychologists and to study them and to make them. They need to make yoga. I'm sure about that. They have to get
They
a
should
lot
be in
of
a
session
zen.
of yoga to make them better focusing. We have seen what is doing Charles on Miami, 2 accidents in the same corner, the same. Come on, and also Carlos. So many things. It's in the driver, not in the team, not in the car.
At the beginning of this segment, we talked a little bit about the fact that Formula One, the FIA, introduced a new aerodynamic formula for 2022. Of course, that was delayed a year. It was originally supposed to be instituted for 21, but it was put off in the Concord Agreement due to the COVID pandemic. Charbel, you had a couple of questions for Bryson along the lines of the current aerodynamic formula. Before we move on to the second segment and talk a little bit about Aston Martin and the massive gains they've made this year, did you want to put your questions to Bryson?
Yeah. Whoever follows Bryson, you should know by now how an aero guy he is. So I have a question that is 2 parts, okay? That has 2 parts. First, do you miss the older generation cars? If we can call them the vortex generative, I don't know, machine. I don't know what we can call them, especially the Y250 and the floor. And the second part, if you remember on the winter testing, the Ferrari has a structural integrity problem on the nose, but probably will we find or will we see such changes or body changes on the cars in the future? It's a gray area. Okay, so whenever you go up to speed, some body parts will change. It will give you some advantage. I'm not talking
Hmm.
about the front wing. We know that the front wing, they have some parts, they move a little bit on the, we can see it on the camera, but on the body itself, do you think that we might see something like this in the future?
You know, it's so funny that you mentioned the previous generation cars. First of all, I do miss them. I do miss our beloved Y250 Vortex, which we had since 2009. You know, pour one out. You know, rest in peace. We definitely love that. And yeah, I mean, people. I do tend to be over enthusiastic about vortices and seeing condensation. In fact, I was, as recently as this morning, tagged in some rather spectacular aircraft landing videos out of Heathrow, seeing some cool vortices being generated there off of 777. So I definitely love that aspect of it. And the current generation cars, the Aero Formula, relying more on the underfloor as opposed to the overbody aerodynamics, the wings and the bodywork, and even with the design of the rear wing with the rolled tips as opposed to the end fences that we had previously, they're just less prone to pulling condensation out of the air. You can't quite see it as clearly. What you actually can see, believe it or not, the strongest flow structure that we see in the current cars isn't actually from the rear wing. It's from the front wing and from the front wing end plate. It turns out that these big, probably aesthetically pleasing end plates that we have for the front wing have a huge aerodynamic impact, and the air trying to get out of the way of the front wheel, sort of squirt sideways, has to flow over that tip in order to escape. And so there's a very strong, tight vortex that comes off of the tip of the front wing end plate, and you usually can't see it with condensation. I think maybe once we saw it in Brazil, but you actually can see it through, I would say, sort of Schlieren-like effects, you know, density gradient effects where it bends the light. So if you look right in the right location at high
At
speed,
the right time, yeah.
you can actually see this vortex snaking its way down the car, which is pretty cool. And I might share a couple of posts later today emphasizing that. So I definitely miss those cars, but I think the current cars are actually doing what they're intending to do. The ability to follow each other is definitely much better, especially in Barcelona, where they changed the track configuration to have two high-speed corners as opposed to the slow chicane. The cars were following each other there very well. We saw more overtakes in Barcelona than we've seen in many, many years. So that's a positive thing, and I'm very happy about that. Regarding deliberate aeroelasticity in the design of the cars, that's always been a hot topic. I think one of the first topics that I decided to comment on when I was entering the F1 Twitter space was Red Bull's flexi rear wing in Barcelona in 2021. And for people who don't know, my master's degree was in aeroelasticity in hypersonics specifically, but you know, some of the same principles apply. And you can exploit this parameter in the design of the cars to reduce drag and kill downforce on the straight when you don't need it. Now, the reason why we don't like it typically is because the failure mode of an overly flexy wing is pretty spectacular. It's pretty crazy. But there are ways in which we can exploit that front wing flexure and a few other things as well. One of the things I will say is, as we go forward at this intermediate range of regulations, we have the big change coming in 2026. We know about the big, engine, the power unit changes. We haven't heard anything about the aerodynamics yet. But one of the things that has been talked about quite a lot by Pat Simmons and others is active aerodynamics in 2026, in the sense of it's almost like having DRS all the time as a means to reduce fuel consumption and improve the aero efficiency of the cars. That also has a particularly dangerous failure mode as well. But I think they're figuring out ways to actually make it work in a safe sense. So as far as air elasticity and active aerodynamics, these are things that are coming. And I think we're going to analyze them in turn as we sort of approach them. But teams are always going to push the limits. You'll never have to worry about teams being too conservative with their designs. If there's any chance, even the slightest possibility that they can exploit the regulations while still legally staying within them to gain performance, they will. So expect to see more from this in the future.
Bryson, that's brilliant. Charbel, did you have anything else for Bryson before we shift to the next topic?
No, that's it for now.
Well,
That's
actually,
brilliant.
I did have one small thing I was hoping to get in before we switch
of course,
topics.
of course.
Actually, just to be clear, even in Bahrain, when Mercedes was clearly off the pace and recognized immediately they needed to shift their concept, I still said they were going to win at least one race over the course of the season. Not only do they have a fantastic driver pairing and they have an incredible ability to develop their car, but Red Bull is so far ahead. Eventually, they will shift focus to 2024. And that will make them a little bit more vulnerable to actually being beaten again. But the one thing I would leave as far as their new concept of car, just think about it like this. Mercedes won a race last year and almost finished second in the Constructors Championship with, by their own admission, the wrong car concept. Imagine how good they could be with the right car concept.
Exactly. Yeah.
Think about the potential that they could actually achieve with a design that wasn't sort of getting in its own way. Now, to be clear, they're not chasing Red Bull. Red Bull is too far ahead, and they're already making changes for 2024. But keep in mind that this should be the first step in a new direction. So there is hope yet for Mercedes fans.
Yeah, yeah. Especially last year, they should have won three races. Two of them because of mistake in strategies. So unfortunately, they won only one. And as you said, yeah, they're gonna focus on next year. Red Bull and Mercedes are not focusing this year to win the championship, but to be, I think, second. I think
That's
so.
brilliant.
Yeah. So
So
Yeah.
shifting from a discussion about Ferrari and Mercedes and Red Bull, I'd like to move into the second segment today, which is all about Aston Martin Formula One. And to back this up a little bit, I think we all remember back in 2018, the former Force India team went into administration. Lawrence Stroll went up against a number of different consortiums that were looking to buy the team and bring it out of administration. He was successfully bought the team, rebranded it Racing Point for a couple of years, transformed it into Aston Martin. He has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrading the facilities. He has bought a huge chunk of the road car division. He has been co-marketing the two of them, and he's made both of them a massive success. And I think we saw most recently that the Aston Martin road car division is posting significant growth year over year, quarter over quarter. And the Formula One team, more importantly, for the context of this conversation, currently sits P3 in the championship. Of course, they were P2 after 6 races. So a phenomenal turnaround for this team. Bryson, I'll kick this over to you before I go to Ahmed and Mamdou and Charbol. But from your perspective, to whom do you credit the massive gains that this team has seen with the AMR 23? Of course, they've largely restaffed in the last couple of years. They brought in Martin Whitmarsh, who was something of a controversial pickup based on some of his Formula One history. Of course, Mike Crack has been the team principal for a couple of seasons now. Luca De Furtado as the engineering director, and Dan Fallows, who I believe may have made contact with you on social media recently as well. He sits there as the technical director. But from your perspective, what is the genesis in the transformation of the AMR 23, and what is enabling them to be so successful on the track as a customer team, which of course is going to change in 26, but currently they are a Mercedes customer team?
Yes, I did make contact with Dan Fallows on Twitter recently, the real Dan Fallows, not the fake one. I that was just a lucky thing. We'll see how long that follow lasts. But I have a tremendous amount of respect for Dan and the team he's put together at Aston Martin. What impresses me about Lawrence Stroll is, yes, he has this super villain energy, sort of a Bond era antagonist. We know he has a lot of money, but the reality of the situation is he's actually doing what many pretenders with money have tried to do. They've tried to produce a fast car and a meaningful force in Formula One and failed. I mean, you look at even Richard Branson with the Virgin Atlantic team. Apparently, it's easier to send a rocket into space than it is to build a successful Formula One team. I mean, it's very, very difficult to do. And in terms of how you actually figure out how they've done what they've done, I think there's really two elements to this. Lawrence Stroll has assembled a small army of engineers from all teams, Mercedes and Red Bull and Williams and other places as well, some of the most talented people, on the grid, and got them together under one roof with a very sort of level organizational structure. And they have sort of one goal in mind, which is to be the fastest that you can be without ego, without commitment to saying we have to have exactly our own design all the time right away. Otherwise, there's nothing. They started off with what you could say is a very humbling experience, in the Spanish Grand Prix last year, of completely scrapping the aero concept of the AMR 22 and going for what was plainly a Red Bull clone, despite on paper them having a version of a wide side-potted car in the wind tunnel back in November of the previous year. But what's impressive is that even though they started with a design that was literally precisely the same as the Red Bull design in shape, they use that as a starting point to develop in their own direction. So if you look at the AMR 23 now, it doesn't look like the RB19 or the RB18 hardly at all. I know Christian Horner made a few quips about saying, oh, now we have a green Red Bull again on the grid. It's good to see they're doing well. But that's really just in jest. Anyone who looks at the fine technical details of the AMR 23 will recognize that it is its own car, not to mention the fact that they have a good, relationship with Mercedes, providing their, power unit and gearbox and, rear suspension. All these things are relevant. Aston Martin also used the wind tunnel for Mercedes' wind tunnel. And to be honest, the success that they've experienced is a blessing in disguise for Mercedes, because it proved that their problem was aerodynamics. It proved for Mercedes that if a team can use your wind tunnel and have the entire same back end of as your car does and still beat you on the track, fundamentally there's something wrong there with your car concept. And so I would argue that knowledge that Mercedes had at the beginning of the season, knowing that they really did have a problem with their car, allowed them to pivot quickly and actually go to a new design concept, which is actually paying dividends now. So in terms of Aston Martin and where they are going, it is true that there's a huge expenditure in facilities and there's wind tunnels and things coming online, but those aren't really active yet. They're still working out of the old Jordan facilities and Silverstone, and some of the real benefits of those new facilities aren't going to come until 2024 and 2025. And so the fact that we're already seeing a very competitive Aston Martin with Fernando Alonso as well, that's already showing that, no, they're really building momentum and they deserve to be respected. I just think that the final sort of cherry on top of that was grabbing the deal with Honda for power units in 2026. That's really all the evidence you need that they are building momentum, that they are serious, and that Honda is as well. So I'm very curious to see how the team develops over time, but they are Mercedes' rival currently. It's not quite clear which of them is going to be in second or third place on July 1st when the ATR restrictions sort of reset around Silverstone time. But that fight's going to go down to the end of the season, I predict, for P2 in the championship.
So I have a question for Ahmed, but before I kick it over to him, and I'm dying to hear his answer to this, I'm going to put it back to the panel. Mamdouh, Charbel, Ahmed, based on what you've seen and what you know of the Aston Martin situation and what Bryson has just described, do you have any questions or follow-up points that you'd like to make to Bryson?
I actually want to add that looking at the Aston Martin this year, as Bryson said, this championship is going to go down to the wire, and all thanks to the Chad Alonso carrying actually the Aston Martin in P2 constructors. What was P2 now is P3. The only good point Mercedes has now is having a great driver lineup. They have statistically the greatest driver of all time, and they have George Russell, dangerously fast. Meanwhile, Fernando Alonso, I'm not going to say he's all alone in the Aston Martin. I just feel like this is what you expect when you have one of the greats like Fernando Alonso next to a good driver like Lawrence Stroll. This is the pace difference you're going to notice. Just the same thing we have seen, let's say, for example, between Max Verstappen and all his teammates after Daniel Ricciardo. It's almost the same thing when you have a great driver, then you have a good driver as your teammate. So but in general, I just feel like I'm more interested to see what the Aston Martin is going to look like after they bring their new upgrades in Canada. That's where I'm more keen to see where they stand up, because if anything, that's going to improve that car and they're going to put them back to where they were, especially after we had a great. And I think if there's anything exciting about, no, I'm not going to say that's the only thing exciting about the season, but one of the most exciting thing about the season people are excited to see is Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton racing each other. And we got that taste of that in Bahrain. And then we got a little bit of it in no, which Australia, and pretty much that's about it. Sometimes there are races where Aston Martin falls off, Mercedes is on a high, and vice versa. So, yeah, I'm just more interested to see what's going to happen in Canada and after Canada.
I'd like to get to the driver conversation in a couple of moments, because that was my question for you, Ahmed. But before we do, Charbel, Mamdou, any questions or reactions to Bryson in terms of the construct of the current Aston Martin Formula One team?
Yeah, I have a question for Bryson. Don't you think, Bryson, that Aston Martin this year is it was prepared more than the other teams, just like the Haas last year? In the beginning of the season, it was delivering and being P6, P7 in the qualifying, even the races, because they understood their car better than others. But then they fell behind in development and everything. Don't you think that Aston Martin this year understood the car better than Mercedes and Ferrari in the beginning of the season, but now they just started to fall back behind Mercedes? Do you still think that Aston Martin will be able to compete with Mercedes all the rest of the year?
Yeah, actually, I think they will definitely be able to compete. I mean, there's no question that, especially Fernando Alonso, has been pretty vocal recently
Yeah, for
about
sure. Yeah.
increasing the turnover rate at which they introduce new parts to their car. They will introduce a pretty significant package in Canada as well. I think what Aston Martin's kind of struggled the most with is just drag. They've had a draggy car. It's been pretty low in the speed traps at most of the races, but it typically has had very good tire preservation. It's phenomenal on the brakes, better than almost any other car on the grid in terms of being on the brakes. And it also has very good out of traction zones. And when we look at what happened in Barcelona and the specific circumstances, circuit configuration and weather conditions that may have kind of caught Aston Martin out a little bit. The removal of that final chicane was definitely a detriment to Aston Martin. Not only did it remove one of the sort of harder braking zones and then another traction zone onto the final straight, which Aston Martin would have made up time in, but it also increased the entry speed to the final straight as well by a significant amount. And so the speed is higher the entire duration of the straight. And so if you did have a drag issue with your car, it's going to be exacerbated by that particular thing. But in terms of how I feel they're going to develop their car and how well they understand it and if they can fight with Mercedes, there's no question that Aston Martin understood their car concept better than Mercedes understood their car concept for the first 5 or 6 races. No question. Because, Mercedes, one of the biggest benefits that came out of the Barcelona race, yes, they had very good pace, and yes, the drivers had confidence in the car, but even more important than those two things, they had better correlation. They were actually able to see, hey, listen, we looked at the performance of the car in the race and in qualifying, and then went back to the simulator, went back to the track simulations, and things were matching up really well as far as downforce levels, center of pressure with the aero balance, all of the things that you would assume that an 8-time championship team would be able to do. They're actually able to do with this car concept, and they weren't simply able to do with the other car concept. So I'm sure there's engineers in Mercedes right now with CFD simulations showing ungodly numbers of downforce and incredible performance with the zero pod design. But for whatever reason, they could not produce that on the track. And I really appreciate Toto Wolff's rather pragmatic way of describing why they changed the SciPod idea, not because they couldn't prove that the other design wasn't good, but because it was a way to eliminate variables. If there was something wrong, if there was something that was problematic with the zero pod idea and the entire philosophy behind the car around that, they could remove that by going to a more traditional concept and at least isolate, sort of zero in on the things that actually could otherwise be making a difference. And clearly that's paying dividends for them. Canada will be much harder for them than Barcelona was. They're good at front limited circuits typically, so I think Canada will be an even better test as to where Aston Martin and Mercedes are relative to each other.
Mamdouh, your perspective, your opinion, and your reaction to Bryson and the rest of the panel's comments with respect to Aston Martin so far this year.
We were talking about Aston Martin as an Aston Martin. It has two complete drivers, while now they have 1.5 drivers, which is Alonso, one driver, Lance Stroll, half driver. This is just to start with.
I'm
we have
Canadian.
1.5 drivers. Yes,
look. Lance is a very competent, very good driver, but as the quality of the car and the pace of the car increases, I mean, it's his deficiencies are being exposed.
There is a very far. Wait, let me tell you something. He is a very far away from Alonso. By the way, very important things. I believe that everyone of our team, they knows that Alonso is the one who's working very hard on the setup of the car, while the others, no, give me the car, I will drive. This is the difference. One day was Michael Schumacher at this status. One day it's Ayrton Senna in the same status. He set up, even Alan Prost, he set up the car in the proper way. This is the difference. Here we have George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. That one, Aston Martin, 1.5 drivers. Here we have 3 drivers. 3 drivers, which is Hamilton, 2 drivers, and George Russell, 1 driver. This is the facts. Sorry for you. I'm not emotional, but this is the facts. We can see when Hamilton wants to hammer the time, he will do it. And by the way, you are talking about Canada and Mercedes, and you will see in Canada, I can put my money on Mercedes to win the race. This is the surprise for you. Please, yes, please. Let me finish. Finish. Yes. Remember that, yes.
Us up for Twitter, but I like it.
You'll surprise because I have seen such races in the 80s and the late 70s, something like that. It could happen. One day was McLaren ahead of anyone in 77, in 76, sorry, in 76, ahead of anyone, while Ferrari, they couldn't close the gap. Then all of a sudden something changed. Then McLaren came back when Lauda had that accident and he stopped for 3 races. He didn't race. Then he came to Japan 76 and he lost the championship because he lost his cheeky. So no, with the rain he cannot see and something like that, he will pull off. So now we go back. The Canada Grand Prix, you will see, because we have seen something very important. If you notice that George Russell, he want to do in Spain, one stop. His tires still going on.
Yeah.
Still going on. It's mean that they have a lot of things on the cars to deliver. Not delivered yet. So we will see it in Canada. Sorry. I'm not dreaming, but this is my long vision.
We are speechless, actually.
I love your optimism for Mercedes, and I think the entire Formula One world would rejoice if and when they win that Grand Prix. Ahmed, I'm going to kick it over to you because I promised I was going to ask you this question, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit so far. Lance Stroll, of course, partnered with Fernando Alonso. 41 years old.
I'm sorry, I think your voice was a little bit muffled. Could you please repeat that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, of course. Pivoting back to the drivers, Lance Stroll, 24 years old, 130 races into his Formula One Grand Prix, is sitting on just 35 points. His 41-year-old teammate, Fernando Alonso, who was brought over from Alpine last season, sits P3 with 99 points. Obviously, from Lawrence Stroll's perspective, this is a challenging conversation to have because the entire construct and point of having a Formula One team is to enable his son to be successful. But is there a point where, if this trend continues in terms of that performance delta between Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll, where people have to ask and honestly broach the question of, hey, if you intend to win a Constructors Championship, can you do it with Lance Stroll piloting one of your two cars, Ahmed?
Look,
And I'll just say,
surely-
you are an honorary Canadian, so be very cautious when you answer this question. I tease.
Look, let's be real. This could be the best chance they could have to be in top 2 in Constructors Championship, right? And if you look at the standings so far, as it looks, Fernando Alonso is I mean, I'm not going to talk about Stroll here, but Perez is much closer to Fernando Alonso than he is closer to Max. And we're talking about Perez in the fastest car here. And Alonso is about, 18 points behind him? So I'm not that kind of person who's going to wish bad omen on anyone. But literally, you can say Fernando Alonso is one DNF away from Perez to become second in the championship momentarily, I'm saying. But the fact that he could do that in that car against a driver who is probably the fastest car of this generation of regulation, it is impressive. Now, when we're going to speak about Lance Stroll, we all know who Lance Stroll is. We've seen some of his impressive drives with Williams. We've seen him pull some good drives in Racing Point, and let's remember specifically the 2020 pink Mercedes. He had some better performances than even Sergio Perez, who won a race. So when we look on the overall, I just think the pressure of him being the same lineup as Fernando, it's kind of putting pressure on him. And moreover, now that his dad owns the team, or not now, he's been owning the team for a while now. He realizes that all eyes is going to be on him, and there will be pressure on his father, not from people or employees who work in the team, but specifically the sponsors. Now, if we're going to speak about sponsors, we all know that sponsors like Aramco are very gracious. They're not going to put pressure on Aston Martin. They didn't even put pressure on Aston Martin last year when they were expecting from them big things and things looked bad. Not alone this year when things are actually looking good. I'm sure Aramco will be happy with what they're seeing. However, there are other sponsors that I'm not going to go mentioning all of them one by one, but they will be looking at that and be like, okay, listen, you have one driver doing very great, but let's talk about your son, because what your son is doing could make us pull a couple of millions out from the next year's budget. And that's something you do not want to hear when you're progressing forward. So less money, more problems, and you're going to end up being spending out of your own pocket than spending from the money you're getting from sponsorships. So in general, and not to keep talking a lot, Lance Stroll is great, but if he keeps after his Spanish Grand Prix form, which was good, but we all know Fernando Alonso was literally playing his bodyguard, where he could have overtaken him and whenever he wanted, when he said tell Lance I'm gonna protect him from the cars behind. And I'm like, oh wow. I was like, who is this guy? I don't know who's this Fernando Alonso. The Fernando Alonso I know, he giggles and be like, I'm faster than X or faster than Y. So the team can tell the other driver Fernando is faster than you. That's the Fernando I know. But this Fernando who tells his teammate what driver setup he should be in and compliment his overtakes while watching it from a big screen and protecting him from other drivers, that's not the Fernando I know. I know that he wants Lance to work and succeed. Maybe he sees something in him, some passion that we don't see, but just the deliverance on the track is what matters. It's almost not there. I mean, if I'm going to compare Lance in the passion, and I'm saying this because I'm sure Fernando Alonso would not be this protective, this compliment towards someone unless he sees something. Of course, the paycheck plays a bigger part of it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the father is paying you to be his teammate at the end of the day, and you're at the age of 41 getting paid 21 million or God knows how much. But I just believe if this gonna keeps up and if he's gonna have more bad performances, I think by the half of the season we could see another driver instead of him. And I'm just saying.
Ahmed, that's a bold prediction. And on that note, and before we pivot to the third segment, I'm going to kick it back to Bryson, because Bryson was given the opportunity to talk about the car physically, the team, and the development of the car and the factory. Bryson, what are your thoughts on this driver pairing? We've heard from Mamdouh, we've heard from Ahmed. I'd love to hear your opinion on the current arrangement in the cockpits of these cars.
Yeah, I'll keep this very brief because we do have other things to mention. But I think that description of the team, 1.5 drivers, is probably accurate. Obviously, everyone loves Lance Stroll. He's a fun guy. He's an interesting guy. And he's probably a very good driver for a midfield team. A midfield team with a midfield car performance is probably a great fit for him. The situation is, it's almost like their plan has gone too well. Yes, Lawrence Stroll wanted to have a team for his son to drive in, but that team is making so much progress and becoming such a force in Formula One. It actually might make Lance the weakest link in the chain. I don't think he's going to be replaced this season or even in the near future, actually. But I think that there's definitely pressure coming from the sponsors and others to say, okay, at some point there actually will be a conversation to be had there. The only final other point I was going to make is, I think Lance's performance relative to Fernando and Checo's performance relative to Max, it really should allow us to put to bed this myth that all you need to win races is a fast car. You just have the fastest car, you'll just win all the races. That's just how everything works, isn't it? I mean, no, that's childishly simplistic. And it requires, every car speaks its own language. You have to unlock it to be able to actually get that level of performance out of it. I mean, if you imagine, what would a Red Bull team look like with 2 Sergio Perez's? What would Aston Martin look like with 2 Lance Strolls? It would be a completely different championship, even if the hardware was exactly the same. And just to be clear, by no means is that a slight against Sergio Perez or even Lance Stroll. They're both very competent drivers, but they're not at the elite level of a Lewis Hamilton. And I would argue at this point now, Max is building up his reputation as being an elite driver. I've argued earlier on in the past he didn't have enough wins and other things to demonstrate that level in the same conversation as a Schumacher or a Hamilton. But he is building on it. He's getting better with his tire preservation, and his qualifying performance in Monaco was special as well. So the final point I was going to make on this was simply that it's mythology to suggest that if you just have the fastest car or even a very competent car, you'll win everything. A driver makes a huge amount of difference, even if it's not immediately obvious.
Before we shift into the reverse gear to talk about a P5 team in the Constructors Championship, Mamdouh, Charbel, Ahmed, any final comments or questions for Bryson before we start talking about the Alpine Renault squad based in Enstone? Okay.
One last thing I want to ask Bryson. Do you think that, especially, I know Mark said this to me, that I have a soft spot to Mercedes, and I'm going to ask him. You have a soft spot for Mercedes, that I'm aware of. When you see the performance of the Mercedes driver lineups, what do you take from it specifically before they bring the upgrades and after they bring the upgrades?
Well, the first thing I would say in general is that everyone, when they saw how close George Russell was to Lewis Hamilton, their default assumption and the cynic in them coming out would just say, was Lewis ever really that great? Was Lewis even really that good? I mean, George is so close to him. Is he really as good as people think he is? The 2 factors I would say in that is having a championship effectively stolen away from you would cause most people to quit the sport entirely. So to be able to come back and actually compete at a high level is impressive in itself, number one. But number two, I don't think people realize how good George Russell actually is. I mean, he is, frankly, annoyingly good at certain times. And the new crop of drivers, I definitely think that he is actually the most competent driver there and the most capable of taking the fight to Max Verstappen. In terms of how those drivers felt with the upgrades to Mercedes, before and after, calling it the W14B or sometimes the W14 Evo, there's no question that George seemed to handle that trickier car a little bit better. Obviously, it has a very forward position of the cockpit relative to where the suspension is. Lewis described it felt like driving on the nose of the car, being on top of the front wheels, which is slightly problematic. And the car just had a very peaky knife edge performance profile. And so adding a bit more benign handling characteristic to the car, giving a bit more confidence to the drivers, and they can't change the seating position mid-season because that's a fundamental part of the monocoque design and a few other things. But the changes to the W14, the front suspension getting a bit more anti-dive, and the aerodynamic changes as well seem to suit Lewis better now than it did George. And what we're starting to see is there is sometimes a little bit of an issue in qualifying and getting these new tires warmed up, which is something that Red Bull struggled with as well in Australia and a few other places. But the race pace now is fantastic. The tire degradation has taken a big step forward versus what it was previously. And so I think that actually is probably the most important takeaway. But the bottom line is the drivers have a lot more confidence in the car now than they did previously. And even if it was exactly the same numerical lap time in simulation, increasing driver confidence is going to ultimately increase the race pace. So it's looking very good for them right now.
Charbel, I know you've got a question for Bryson as well before we pivot away. Mike.
Yeah, you're muted.
My bad. I will cut it. So let's say a little bit about in the topic of Aston Martin. So with other teams bringing new upgrades, we are seeing their upgrades are moving more toward Aston Martin's design, not Red Bull design. Okay, so can you explain a little bit? Did the teams saw more advantages in that design rather than going to Red Bull's design?
You know what? I almost even wouldn't say that Aston Martin is the primary source of the design inspiration here. I think Alpine is also there as well. And if I were to look at the changes that Mercedes made to their car recently, it's true that they have a bit of a gully or a water slide in their side pod, which is pretty interesting. But I would say it's actually much more akin to what Alpine has done versus what Aston Martin has done. Aston Martin's water slide is deep. It disappears into the abyss. You can't even see it from most
slide
pictures.
the baby in that.
That's one way to describe it. Yes, that's one possible description. One baby's width. Yes, that seems to make sense. But no, I think I think there's also subtle differences between all of these cars, and in fact, some of the most important things of the Aston Martin we can't even see. I mean, they're the only team that we haven't gotten a good look at their underfloor yet. We've seen Ferrari, we've seen Alpine, we've seen Mercedes, we've seen Red Bull. Even though Lance crashed in the Grand Prix, we still didn't see the bottom of his floor. So that's something to sort of keep in mind. That I think it is simple to say that people are pushing, not simple, but it's understandable to think that people are pushing towards Aston Martin as opposed to Red Bull. But I'm seeing a lot of influence from all the teams on each other. In fact, Red Bull recently admitted that one of their design changes to the rear of their diffuser was a direct consequence of something that Williams was doing last year, in fact, in the exact shape of their diffuser geometry that they found was beneficial to them as well. So I think a better way to think about this is every team is looking at every other team, and they're evaluating whether the concepts they find on their rivals could actually be applied to their own car, and if they can, and within the cost cap and other considerations. I think they are going to be putting it there. The final thing I would say is, yes, Ferrari is also shifted to a more downwashing aft design to their side pod. We would think that's more Red Bull like or more Alpine like, but honestly, it doesn't look like either of those. It looks like the curvature point where it goes from straight back to downwards is so far aft on the Ferrari, and it's so far forward on the Mercedes. There's such a radical distinction there in the way they're approaching the problem. I think in general, a wide side pod downwashing aft solution will be the right part of the design space to go in, but there's still quite a lot of variation between the teams.
I think this is the perfect time to pivot to a team that has maybe been as surprising as Aston Martin has been this year, but for very different reasons. And I'm going to back this up to the beginning of 2022. Otmar Szafnauer made the move over from Aston Martin. Of course, he had been the team principal of Force India and Aston Martin Racing Point for many, many years, had typically been credited for doing a lot with very little in terms of financial resources. And it was seen as a coup when he took over at the beginning of 2022. Of course, 2022 itself was a bit of a choppy year. We had the surprise exit of Fernando Alonso. And of course, it was reported at the time that he disrespected Otmar by making the move and not reporting directly to Otmar that was happening. The team then subsequently announced that Oscar Piastri was going to take a seat in that car next to Esteban Ocon for 23, which he then disputed on social media and promptly signed with McLaren. So it wasn't a good look, and there were some PR disasters for that team in 2022. Of course, last year's Challenger was a car that Otmar had inherited, and the A523, their 2023 Challenger, is a car that he largely oversaw from a development perspective. Currently, Alpine Renault, the Enstone-based squad, sits P5 in the championship, which is probably a result that is disappointing to them, especially as a all-in works team. Bryson, to you, where do the challenges, the problems arise from? A couple of weeks ago, Laurent Rossi, the CEO of the Alpine Group, the road car and the F1 team, was very vocal when being interviewed by Canal Plus. He cited the faults of largely everyone within the organization. But from your perspective, where do their failings start? Is it driver? Is it car? Is it something else?
Weirdly enough, I think Laurent Rossi is actually at the center of all of these problems. He's at the center of the driver situation with Oscar Piastri and Alonso. His unwillingness to give Alonso a 2+1 deal at Alpine is one of the motivating factors for why he went to Aston Martin. So I would argue that he did that, and then assuming, essentially, that he could just put Oscar Piastri on the back burner until he felt it was useful to have him, also ended up burning him, and he lost him as well. I mean, obviously, compared to the McLaren performance and the Alpine performance, Piastri may be thinking slightly a little bit about that, but ultimately, Laurent Rossi is arguably the reason why they had all of their kerfuffle, so to speak, around the drivers, and even his odd decision to publicly slate his own team at the Miami Grand Prix, as you mentioned, even though it seems plausible that, he was very aggressive in letting a fire under them, and look how well they performed in Monaco. Clearly, that's the reason why. But ultimately, the changes to the car that they made in Monaco and the hard work being put in to make that car competitive was done weeks in advance before Laurent Rossi decided to publicly talk about his team in that way. So I would argue that the people who actually deserve credit for that performance is the team itself, not necessarily the management that is criticizing them, even if he chooses to take credit for it, so to speak. So I imagine there are many ways to approach this particular issue, but there are some very talented people working at Alpine, and they have a pretty good, driver pairing. Ocon and Gasly are both, creditable drivers. They've both won races, and given the performance of Fernando Alonso now at Aston Martin, in retrospect, it actually makes Ocon look even better than he did previously, given how close they were in the previous season. And so what I suspect is that even though they are having problems in a general sense, I mean, if you're Alpine and you see a team that you were fighting with last year for 6th or 7th go to P2, almost P2 in the Constructors Championship, fundamentally that means you've failed in some sense. And so if I were them, I would simply view it as an opportunity. It proves that there's more performance there on the table, and there's no reason why they can't close that performance gap in terms of lap time, even if others do the same thing and you end up in kind of a similar place. The car can definitely be made faster, and so that's what I would focus on. I think Otmar Szafnauer is doing the best he can in a difficult situation and doing what he can to make the team as competitive as possible. I don't really have any doubts in his leadership as far as leading that team, but it would be nice for them to see some more tangible results in the near term.
Ahmed, I have a question for you, and I know you have a question for Bryson regarding Alpine and the driver pairing, et cetera. My question to you is, based on what we've seen over the last couple of Grand Prix, what do you think the ceiling is for this team? They currently sit on 40 points. Do you think we will see a significantly improved Renault over the final 2/3 of the season? Or do you think that where we see them now is maybe the ceiling based on this driver pairing in the current car?
I mean, I think Alpine, or previously known as Renault, would have had many chances to be up there fighting in the top 3 or top 2 even for Constructors Championship. They had the drivers, they had the facilities. It's just there's a gray area that they're missing, and I can't put my hands on it. I can't actually quite yet tell you what it is, because unless somebody just mentions it out of the blue, like, yeah, that. But there's another thing, since you guys have been talking about Rossi, I just feel like Rossi should start talking less and let the team do the work. And when I say that, I mean coming into Monaco after getting that P3, which is a phenomenal result for the team, by the way. We all expected almost only 3 to 4 teams to be on the podium this season. Red Bull, obviously, they're going to win almost every race if nothing goes wrong that we know of. But then still we have P3, the third car in the who's going to be the third car on the podium. So we're all expecting either Mercedes, Aston Martin, Ferrari, if they have it really right and they get it together, like as we saw in Baku. But nobody would be expecting Alpine to jump on that P3 as well. So when I look at their performance in Monaco, and I'm like, that's actually a great result for the team, because again, that podium is a couple of millions of dollars into your pocket by the end of the season. But then when you come out and say, we are not kidding when we tell you, coming to Spain, we go on to challenge Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, and we're going to be a threat for them. When you come up with a statement like that, and at the end of the day, that's the result you get in the Spanish Grand Prix. Now, it's not like I'm going to say they had the performance and then something bad happened. I would say some contact at the beginning of the race, something ruined their race that made them slot back behind Aston Martin, Ferrari, and Mercedes. It just, the performance wasn't there. So unnecessary comments like that is just what draws people away from the team sometimes. It doesn't matter who, either sponsors, either, I would say, very experienced drivers. And I am sure they got their hand probably on the best driver pairing they could wish for, because Gasly is a very capable driver. Ocon doesn't need introduction as well. And these are 2 young drivers who are looking to be in Formula One and stay in Formula One. So their best bet, it is Alpine. Now, if you're going to ask me, would Ocon and Gasly leave Alpine for a better team? In a heartbeat, they would do it. If Red Bull, Mercedes, even Aston Martin pick up the phone, be like, would you be interested to join? They would do it in a heartbeat. If Alonso, who's more experienced, and this is a man in a that's it. He stepped into his 40s. He doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, but he still has the passion. Just like a lot of drivers on the grid, leaves the team because he just felt like the passion is not there, or just like how Fernando described it, the seriousness is not there. He's like, when I see a team celebrating a P6, P5, that's for me, it's like, what are you guys doing? Like 2021, you guys were competing for podiums and even managed to take a win from the mouth of Max and Lewis, or Red Bull and Mercedes. And now you're celebrating a P5, P6. That should not be the goal at the beginning of a new regulation. So overall, if there's anything I have big question marks on, is not Gasly, is not Ocon, is not. Look, I do I point fingers a little bit here and there sometimes on Otmar. I do joke about it sometimes, but the real finger should be pointed at the HQ and the management, and specifically Rossi, who reminds me of that Kevin Durant meme that says, a man only shows up when everything is built. So he only comes when there's a podium in hand, and shows up, celebrates with the team and everything, and things doesn't go well, he just bashes them and be like, yeah, this team needs to be changed. So if there's anything, he should be looking into himself. That's my opinion.
Ahmed, before I kick it over to Charbel, because I know Charbel's got some comments and it's questions for Bryson. Did you have any questions for Bryson based on his summary of the current circumstance? Because it sounds like the two of you are generally pretty aligned when it comes to Laurent Rossi possibly being the root of a lot of the challenges at the Enstone team. Cool. I will take that as an alignment. No question.
I mean, look, just to be clear, I imagine I could be making things more difficult for myself if, for some reason, I find myself in the Formula One space and working with Laurent Rossi. I just want to be clear that this is a salvageable situation. I just have some issues with the way it's been handled up to this point.
Right. Charbel, I'll kick it over to you. Any comments, thoughts, reflections on the Alpine performance, and any questions for Bryson?
I'm gonna add up the same thing that the guys just said before, and ironically, I can see the same situation back with Cyril Abitboul previously. Always talks. We're gonna be competing in 2020 for the championship, and they are always having like a reliability problem, internal problem in the team. You hit one day you hit, and the other day they miss. So it's always like this. It has always been with Renault and now Alpine. So I can't add even more on the guys.
Any questions for Bryson before we pivot and we go to our last segment of the day?
For my side, no. Ahmed, I don't know if you have any question for Bryson.
I don't think I need to ask Bryson anything more than
I think there's a general sense of alignment here on the subject of Alpine Renault.
Yeah.
So on that, I think now is the perfect time to shift into our last topic. And our last topic of the day is a reflection, a review of the progress and the development of the 2023 rookies. So, of course, at the beginning of the year, last summer, Alpine announced that Oscar Piastri, the young Australian driver, was going to be joining their driver pairing. Of course, he dismissed that quickly, and there was some massive PR fallout. He ultimately joined McLaren, which is where he was rumored to be going. Nick De Vries was a surprise add for AlphaTauri after that P10 finish in a temporary role with Williams last year at Monza. And of course, Logan Sargent, the first American on the grid since Alexander Rossi back in 2015. He joined the grid with Williams. Throw this to you, Bryson. Is the sample too small based on 7 races, or are we beginning to get a pretty good understanding of the development trajectory of these drivers and what what their runway is in Formula One?
Well, I think, just going team by team, I would say Logan Sargent is actually comparing very well to Alex Albon in terms of raw pace. Raw qualifying pace is pretty good, but the race pace is actually quite good compared to Alex. This issue right now is just that he's a bit too mistake prone. In the rare situations when the Williams has been able to actually, score a big result, their weekend has been compromised by issues, crashes like in Jeddah, for example, with Sargent, and another crash in Barcelona as well, that damaged, not only his confidence, but also, importantly, the floor. And there are big changes to make that car viable, basically, for the qualifying and the race. And so that has an impact downstream on cost cap and all kinds of other things and data correlation that you didn't get. So, Logan is pretty quick, but he's still a little bit prone to errors, and hopefully he'll be able to iron that out. Oscar Piastri is already demonstrating that his selection over Daniel Ricciardo was not a mistake. More often than not, he's right there with Lando and has beaten him in several situations. Even in Jeddah, he would have had a very good race if it were not for literally running into the debris. Or Lando would have had a good race if it wasn't for running into the debris from Oscar. And they've been very close. It certainly isn't the case that the second driver is like a second behind or whatever it was in qualifying with Daniel Ricciardo. That's not to say that Daniel Ricciardo isn't a good driver, but this is once again trying to emphasize that it takes more than a fast car to be fast. Even if you're a fast driver in one car, that doesn't mean you're going to be fast in another car, and you have to adjust your driving style to be able to account for that. And some drivers can do it, and some drivers can't. Piastri is definitely a better fit for the current era McLaren than Daniel Ricciardo was. The McLaren still has an aero efficiency problem. It has kind of okay downforce, but just way too much drag for the downforce that it produces. And so they're also looking to make some major changes. Obviously, there was a huge organizational shakeup in McLaren, which is going to help them, but the driver isn't really the problem. Oscar Piastri is doing quite well. Nick de Vries, he entered Formula One with much fanfare, having tested for seemingly or done practice sessions with seemingly every Mercedes-powered car on the grid. And of course, he scored a sensational points finish at the Italian Grand Prix last year. And so was, of course, highly rated and was expected to go into AlphaTauri and be the leader of that team. But that hasn't been the case at all. And yes, it's true that de Vries has made mistakes here and there, and there's been some issues that have hampered his races. His collision with the barrier in Baku was a tough one, especially given that Lance Stroll hit that same barrier harder than he did and didn't retire. So it's actually down to the mechanical design and strength of the AlphaTauri, more so than purely his mistake. But at the same time, you have to recognize how good of a job Yuki Tsunoda has done. He has stepped up into the leadership role of AlphaTauri, and the fact that there were rumors swirling around about Daniel Ricciardo getting a seat at AlphaTauri, even though those were denied by the team and saying that's not what happened. The fact that so many people believed it and it was plausible to such a large group of people is evidence that Nick de Vries is not where he expected to be or where anyone expected him to be. So people who know me know that Helmut Marko is not my favorite person. But what he said about Nick de Vries is probably accurate, is that he doesn't have the red card yet, but he does have the yellow card in terms of if he wants to be, a long-term figure, a persistent figure in the Formula One paddock, he's going to have to do better than he's doing. I think he can do that. And I think, Barcelona is probably one of the better examples of what he could do. He is actually going to more tracks that he's actually raced at before. He hadn't raced at any of the previous tracks that he'd been to earlier in the season, believe it or not, for various reasons. And so once he gets to a few more tracks that he's more familiar with, I think that he'll be more on Yuki's pace. But overall, Nick de Vries needs to do better. Oscar Piastri is doing great. And Logan Sargent is quick, but makes too many mistakes.
Charbel, I'll kick it over to you before we conclude this segment with Ahmed. From your perspective, are the performances that we're seeing with these three drivers, considering all of the circumstances that Bryson just described, track familiarity and the capability of the car and the leadership at the head offices, is this maybe what you would have expected? Or are these drivers farther along their development trajectory, maybe a little bit farther behind?
Well, Mark, they are right where we expect them to be, because first of all, if you can compare them to more experienced drivers, they are doing very good, especially in the cars that they are either Williams, so they are doing very good. But the question is, what next? Okay, so I know the drivers are thinking the same. What next? When I'm gonna get upgraded, okay, to a higher level, if we can take it like that, to a higher level team. For example, let's take George Russell. He was very lucky because he had Mercedes in his back. He's a Mercedes guy since before Formula One, and he was sitting in Williams until he got a free seat in Mercedes. But what's next for these guys? Are we gonna still see them for 2 years in the same seat, in the same car, until someone will replace them? That's the question.
You're muted.
Great. The moderator's the last person that should have a muted mic. And you think that 3 years into COVID, people would be used to this. Ahmed, I'll kick it over to you before we open it up to questions from the panel for Bryson. But your perspective on the drivers, any surprises this year? Do you still believe that they were the right fit, or maybe these teams should have gone in a different direction during the offseason?
I'll be honest with you. Coming from Piastri, look, I'm not gonna say, oh yeah, I was expecting Piastri to do good. Oh my god, I'm shocked De Vries did this. Oh my god, what do I expect even from Logan Sargent? That will be the wrong thing to say, because when you get a rookie, you never know what you get in. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many championships they've won in other categories, especially in open wheels, how good they were in open wheels. When you jump from a machine to another, it's like you are getting introduced entirely to something new to you. It's just like basically how can I say, you're getting introduced from driving a Mercedes GT car to a NASCAR, for example. Well, they're all not open wheel cars, but still the fundamentals are completely different to know how to drive them. So many people were expecting a lot of great things from Nick De Vries, and let's be honest, we all did. And everyone was expecting, oh yeah, maybe Yuki this year is going to be at risk if he doesn't perform, especially after looking at his performance last year. It was not the best of the performances out there. And then we come to this season, we get completely the opposite of our expectations. However, Oscar Piastri is doing the best he can with the car he has, and it's not like he's the only one struggling with that car. Even Lando, despite the impressive P3 in qualifying from Lando in Spain, but still the fact that even Piastri pushed it to Q3 and was there to fight for a couple of positions basically in the Q3, that is also impressive. So in terms of Piastri, you can tell that the team is confident in what he's doing and they're believing in him, because again, they don't believe in you just because they want to believe in you. They believe in you based on the performances you put out there, in regards of whatever happens with the car, from mechanical issues or whatever, some unfortunate incident, like for example what happened with them in Saudi. Lando Norris wing end plate broke and flew right off the back and actually hit Piastri's car. So that's one of the rarest unlucky accidents you will get. However, when we come down to Logan Sargent, now he had some good performances, especially after his first race in Bahrain. I was very impressed that he was P12 and he was in contention for P10, fighting with Tsunoda and Albon. It was a great fight to see him do that, especially when he is fighting with two other drivers that have been in F1 now more. They're not rookies anymore, we can say. So, but then I think ever since Baku or ever since Australia, his performance wasn't the best so far. Now he is doing great to keep it out of the walls and out of the barriers, but that's not what the team is looking for. They're not looking for you to save money by not crashing, but they're looking for you to gain something out of the car and probably even help them. When one driver is not there, you have to be there to even snatch a point if the opportunity presents itself. So I think we haven't had, if I'm being realistic, we haven't had a great rookie season in a very long time. We didn't have that one season where like, oh my God, we have some great rookies coming in. Take, for example, you know what? I'm not going to miss out mentioning names because once you do that, then people will jump on you, be like, oh, how about this driver? How about that driver? But in general, I think it's been a very long time since we ever had a rookie season where we're just impressed by what these rookies are doing on the track for their first year. And Bryson, I think you have something to say. Go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say the best example is probably Lewis Hamilton. I mean, one of the most insane rookie seasons of all time. It would be like a rookie going into Max Verstappen's team and beating him. That's essentially what was going on in 2007. So that's all.
Exactly. That's one of them. And if there's any other rookies we could remember actually after 2007, who could come to mind that we could be like, I mean, you know what? Nico Hulkenberg, he didn't have a bad start. It's just, especially like the guy just jumped into the car and pole position.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin Magnussen had a very good start to his career at McLaren. Just things unraveled, unfortunately.
Yeah, Kevin Magnussen, Sergio Perez wasn't bad as well, but it's not like again, the machinery he had, there was not much to expect from it. He started in the McLaren, if I'm not wrong. That's what.
Oh yeah, Kevin Magnussen started with McLaren. Yeah,
and Sergio Perez as well, if I'm not wrong.
Sergio Perez started with Sauber, I want to say.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
He and Sergio Perez went to McLaren after Lewis left.
Yeah, yeah. So, but yeah, you're right. Sorry about that. Thank you for correcting me. So yeah, in general, there are not many, to close this point, there are not so many memorable rookie seasons, other than I would say that we all remember, be like, oh yeah, his rookie season was phenomenal. Like Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel. Sebastian Vettel, I think was it his second season, won in a minority potentially first season.
Yeah.
It's first
In a
season.
minority. He didn't win in a car of a generation. That's a minority with a V10, a coffin V10 that was not supposed to be even on the grid. And with the technologies back then, that engine, it's so outdated compared to other on the track. So, and then you have even Nico Rosberg had an impressive rookie season, but then yeah, the list just keeps dying, and you don't remember at the top of your head some rookie. You'll be like, oh, yeah, well, he was impressive. Yeah, he had a great season. It's just unfortunately big teams now, they don't have that faith and trust in them to be like, you know what, this is a championship winning car, I'm going to put a rookie in it. That you don't see that anymore.
Gentlemen, I would like to wrap up the show with giving each of you the opportunity to make one bold prediction. But before we do that, and knowing again that we are very fortunate to have Bryson joining us today, Charbel, Ahmed, we've covered a bunch of topics today. There's a whole bunch of other storylines in F1 this year. Any questions for Bryson on any topic before we move to our predictions and then wrap up the show?
Ahmed,
Okay.
do you have anything?
I'm
not gonna say any. I'm not gonna ask him everything right now because we want him another time, another episode. So I'm gonna keep
save
some
questions for part two. So
yeah,
on that note, Mamdouh kicked this off, so I'm not going to pass it over to him because he's already made a bold prediction, and of course, his bold prediction is that Mercedes is going to win the Canadian Grand Prix, which is bold prediction. I'm going to start with you, Ahmed. We'll go to Charbel and then Bryson, and then we'll wrap this up. What is your bold prediction for the rest of the 2023 season? And I will hold you to it.
Well, if I'm going to say, oh, yeah, Mercedes probably going to win. Oh, my God, Aston Martin maybe is going to win. Or maybe Ferrari. What's going to be the most predictable thing ever to say, since these three cars probably are the closest sometimes with their pace. But if I'm going to go bold, and I have to, just send it, I have two predictions this year. I'm just going to say it.
We got 30 seconds. You got to make them quick.
Okay. Lance Stroll could snatch a podium or a win this year. And I'm just putting it out there.
That's your honorary Canadian citizenship talking?
Nico Hülkenberg could get a P4 or even a podium this year.
Okay, awesome. Charbel, I'll kick it over to you. Those are some pretty bold predictions. Charbel, what do you think?
Well, I've made my predictions in the beginning of the season, and I have it on my Twitter page. So I've hit 80% till now from my predictions, and the gap it's gonna be bigger. And I've said Red Bull first, second Mercedes, third Aston Martin, and the fourth Ferrari. McLaren, I've put McLaren in the last, but it made a jump. But some big prediction, I'm gonna say we're gonna see a big change up in Ferrari.
Fantastic. And Bryson, before we wrap this up, any predictions, any bold predictions that you would make now based on 7 races of data that maybe you wouldn't have made in the off season?
Well, first of all, I wanted to have a commentary on Ahmed's prediction, which is quite funny with Hülkenberg getting his podium, the mythical podium he's never achieved in his entire career in Formula One. Every time he seems to get close, it goes away. I predict, rather cynically, that he will get a podium, but it will be in a sprint race.
And if I'm sorry to add something, we were on the verge to have a Nico Hülkenberg podium in Australia if it wasn't for the red flag.
Very possibly, and I understand that, but that's not my actual prediction. My actual prediction is what I've been trying to say for the entire season, despite people saying I'm wrong. And Red Bull is the most dominant car we've seen in the entire time. There's no chance they can be caught, and this is going to be absolute clean sweep. And I'm just saying no, Red Bull will not win every race of the 2023 season. Yes, their car is very dominant right now. Yes, they have a very competent pairing of drivers, but circumstances always seem to conspire against you to prevent you from winning every single race. Not only the fact that we have more races now than we've really ever had in the past, and we have sprint races, which are implicitly designed to jeopardize your race weekend for our entertainment. So no, I just don't think that the doom and gloom predictions that Red Bull will win every race will come true. I think Aston Martin, Mercedes, Ferrari,
Mercedes, yeah.
maybe even Alpine. That's or McLaren in some crazy track like a Hungary or a Zandvoort where aero efficiency is less of a premium than raw downforce. I think they'll come under pressure genuinely.
Charbel, on that
Especially in the
note,
second half of the season, we're gonna see what Bryson is talking about.
definitely. Charbel, on that note, it's time to wrap up the show. Charbel, I'm going to kick it over to you. Where can people find you? Where can they see your thoughts and your Formula One musings?
So mainly on Twitter, okay, so F1 Techie, and also I'm active a little bit on Instagram, and everything, they can see everything over there.
Ahmed, same question to you. Where can people follow you on social media?
Twitter, but I have no information to add to you guys. So if you follow me, just following me for the laugh. That's about it.
I love it. And then finally, Bryson, once again, we cannot thank you enough for joining us today on MENA Grand Prix Talk. Where can people follow you? You've got a podcast that you spoke to a couple of minutes ago. Where can people find that?
Yeah, so I mean, me personally, I'm at Natural Paradigm on Twitter, and I'm also building an Instagram presence as well. You can indirectly thank Elon Musk and his odd decision making for that contingency plan, contingency plan that I built for myself. But I should thank him. I suppose it's been really fun being on Instagram and enjoying the time over there. We do have the Tech Heads F1 podcast, which is on Twitter, but also on Instagram. You can follow it on Spotify, iTunes, and Google. And essentially, we were just talking tech talk all the time. We were not claiming to be technical experts working in the field for 30 years, but we are all extreme tech enthusiasts. Myself, my co-host, Dr. Obbs and Molly, we all have engineering backgrounds, and we just love talking tech. So if that's your thing, definitely give us a follow.
I can certainly vouch it is one of the best Formula One podcasts on the internet. Of many, there are so many now, but it's certainly one of the very best. Once again, my name is Mark Hamilton. Thank you so much for joining us on the MENA Grand Prix Talk. We hope you enjoyed this show, and here's to having Bryson on once again in the future. Thanks again. Bye for now.